What are you thinking and feeling when you kill someone?
It's just like that drug. I'm after that drug again. I don't have an on and off switch. I'm just after that drug. I'm after that feeling.
In December 1999, the quiet border town of Del Rio, Texas, became the scene of a nightmare no family could have imagined. 13-year-old Kaylene Harris was celebrating the new year with friends when a drifter broke into her home in the middle of the night. That man was Tommy Lynn Sells, a transient killer who claimed to have murdered as many as 70 people while drifting from state to state. Armed with a knife, Sells brutally stabbed Kaylene as she slept. He then turned the blade on her best friend, 10-year-old Krystal Surles, slashing her throat. But in an act of sheer willpower, Krystal survived. Bloodied and gasping for air, she staggered to a neighbor's home, and with a whisper description, set into motion the capture of one of America's most elusive serial killers. What investigators would uncover was chilling. A life of violence that stretched coast to coast, crimes so random and senseless that they baffled law enforcement for decades. Sells wasn't just a murderer. He was a predator who thrived on chaos and confessed to killings wherever his path led him. But in Texas, it was the death of Kaylene Harris that sealed his fate. Convicted of capital murder, he was sentenced to die by lethal injection. 15 years later, after countless appeals and legal battles over the very drugs used in executions, Tommy Lynn Sells made his final walk to the death chamber. He declined a last meal, refused to give final words, and at 6:27 p.m. on April 3, 2014, he was pronounced dead. To understand how a drifter became one of the most feared serial killers in America and how a young girl's courage finally brought him down, we have to go back to the beginning. But first, hit subscribe and tap the notification bell, because this is a case that doesn't just haunt a family, it haunts a nation. Tommy Lynn Sells was born on June 28, 1964, in Oakland, California, into a world already shaped by instability and hardship. His father abandoned the family before he was even old enough to remember, leaving his mother, Nina, to raise him and his siblings largely on her own. From the very beginning, Tommy's life was marked by neglect and chaos, and at just 18 months old, tragedy struck when he contracted meningitis, a severe brain infection that nearly killed him. Though he survived, doctors later suggested the illness caused permanent brain damage, impairing his emotional regulation and decision-making, planting early seeds for the violent instability that would define his future. By the time Tommy was a child, his home life was anything but nurturing. Accounts suggest his mother favored his siblings and often left Tommy feeling unwanted and rejected. As a result, he developed deep feelings of abandonment and anger. When most children his age were learning structure, discipline, and love, Tommy was left unsupervised, drifting through a childhood without boundaries. By age 7, he began drinking alcohol, often sneaking beers and liquor whenever he could find them. And by his early teens, he was experimenting with harder substances, numbing himself against the pain of neglect. At just 14 years old, overwhelmed by the dysfunction at home and already addicted to alcohol, Tommy Lynn Sells made the decision to run away, setting himself on a path of homelessness and transience that would define his adult life. He hopped trains, hitchhiked across the country, and lived on the margins of society. With no education, no stability, and no family to guide him, he quickly turned to petty crime as a means of survival. He burglarized homes, stole cars, and drifted from town to town, leaving behind only fragments of his existence: arrests, police records, and frightened strangers. His criminal behavior escalated throughout the late 1970s and 1980s, with prison stints in multiple states for crimes such as theft, assault, and drug-related offenses. Each time he was released, he returned to the same destructive cycle, drifting across America, abusing drugs and alcohol, and lashing out violently at anyone who crossed his path. The system repeatedly cycled him in and out of jails, never fully addressing the deeper psychological issues that were festering within him. Over the years, psychological evaluations painted a disturbing picture. Doctors described him as manipulative, impulsive, and devoid of empathy. He was diagnosed with multiple personality disorders, including antisocial tendencies that made him incapable of forming genuine human connections. He displayed violent fantasies, explosive anger, and a chilling indifference toward human life. Yet because he drifted constantly, crossing state lines and changing identities, he often slipped through the cracks of law enforcement and mental health systems, never staying in one place long enough for anyone to truly understand the danger he posed. By his late teens and early 20s, Tommy Lynn Sells had already transformed from a troubled boy into a hardened drifter, someone who carried the scars of neglect, addiction, and illness, but also someone who harbored a growing taste for violence. His early life was not merely troubled. It was the foundation of a storm that would one day explode in a string of crimes so brutal, so senseless, that they would earn him the chilling title of the coast-to-coast killer. By the late 1970s, Tommy Lynn Sells had evolved from a troubled drifter into something far more dangerous. A predator who seemed to thrive on chaos, striking without reason, remorse, or pattern. Between 1978 and 1999, Sells would later claim he killed as many as 70 people, an astonishing number that, if true, would make him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. While investigators could only confirm his involvement in at least 22 murders, the chilling reality was that his transient lifestyle, constantly moving from state to state, never holding down a job, and living off thefts and odd work, allowed him to slip through the cracks of law enforcement. Each new town became an opportunity, and each victim a chance for him to indulge the violent urges that had been festering since childhood. Unlike many serial killers who followed a predictable pattern, Sells' crimes were terrifying precisely because they were so random. He targeted women, children, and even entire families, often killing without motive beyond the thrill of the act itself. Some victims were hitchhikers who made the mistake of accepting his offer of a ride. Others were families sleeping safely in their homes, unaware that a killer was about to break in and shatter their world forever. His violence knew no boundaries. He could move from stabbing a child to assaulting a stranger within days, leaving investigators in different states baffled by the sheer unpredictability of his trail. Throughout the 1980s, Sells roamed the highways and backroads of America, picking up hitchhikers, often young women or teenage girls, whom he would later assault and kill. In interviews years later, he spoke about these crimes with a disturbing nonchalance, recalling how easy it was to lure vulnerable people into his vehicle and how little effort it took to make them disappear. Because these crimes spanned so many jurisdictions and victims were scattered across states, many cases went unsolved for years, with families never knowing who had taken their loved ones. In 1997, his violence escalated in Springfield, Missouri, where he brutally murdered a young mother and her child in their home. The attack sent shockwaves through the community, not only for its savagery, but also for the randomness of the crime. There was no personal connection, no robbery, only pure violence. Investigators at the time struggled to piece together who could commit such an atrocity, and Sells, already drifting onward to another state, vanished before suspicion could fall on him. Just 2 years later, in 1999, Sells struck again in Kentucky, murdering Haley McCone, a young girl whose life was cut short in yet another act of senseless brutality. By now, his crimes bore a distinct and horrifying pattern. Late-night home invasions, breaking into houses under the cover of darkness, armed with a knife, and slaughtering whoever he encountered inside. For Sells, there was no hesitation, no remorse, and no boundaries. He seemed to gain satisfaction from destroying the sanctity of the home, invading spaces where people believed they were safest. Each killing left behind not just victims, but devastated families, unanswered questions, and communities gripped by fear. Sells rarely stayed in one place for long. He lived out of cars, cheap motels, and strangers' couches, always ready to move on the moment suspicion grew too close. This transience, combined with the lack of coordinated national law enforcement databases at the time, allowed him to remain invisible, a phantom drifting along America's highways, leaving only blood and grief in his wake. For nearly 2 decades, his rampage went unchecked, Law enforcement in different states pursued their own unsolved cases, rarely suspecting that the same man was responsible for so many. It wasn't until the night of December 31st, 1999, when Sells chose the wrong house in the small town of Del Rio, Texas, that his reign of terror would finally come to an end. But before that, he had already cemented his place as one of the most terrifying figures in modern American crime, a killer without pattern, without conscience, and without end. On the night of December 31st, 1999, as the small border town of Del Rio, Texas, prepared to welcome the new year, a sense of celebration filled the air. Families gathered, children stayed up late, and neighborhoods hummed with the promise of a fresh start. But inside the modest Harris household, tragedy was about to strike in a way so horrific that it would not only devastate a family, but also bring an end to the reign of one of America's most elusive serial killers. That night, 13-year-old Kaylene Harris, a bright, fun-loving girl, was spending the evening at home with friends, including 10-year-old Krystal Surles, a shy and kind-hearted child who had been staying the night. The girls had no way of knowing that just outside their quiet home, lurking in the darkness, was Tommy Lynn Sells, a transient drifter armed with a knife and driven by urges he could no longer control. In the early hours of the morning, while the town slept, Sells broke into the Harris residence. Moving silently through the house, he crept into the girl's bedroom. There, in an act of unimaginable brutality, he attacked Kaylene Harris as she lay in her bed, stabbing her multiple times in a frenzied assault that left her with no chance of survival. Kaylene's life, filled with promise and innocence, was stolen in seconds, the room transformed into a scene of chaos and bloodshed. But Sells was not finished. Turning his attention to Krystal Surles, he slashed her throat in an attempt to silence her forever. For any other child, the wound would have been fatal, but Krystal displayed a strength and determination that even her attacker could not have imagined. Despite her severe injury, bleeding heavily and unable to speak, she managed to summon every ounce of willpower she had left. Staggering from the bedroom and out of the house, she crossed the yard and made her way to a neighbor's home. With gestures and whispered sounds, she begged for help, her throat torn but her spirit unbroken. The neighbor immediately called for emergency assistance, and as medical teams rushed to save Krystal's life, her whispered descriptions of the man who had attacked her became the breakthrough investigators needed. Against all odds, this 10-year-old girl, scarred but alive, became the key eyewitness in the case that would finally bring down Tommy Lynn Sells. Her bravery not only exposed the man responsible for Kaylene's murder, but also connected authorities to a predator who had been slipping through the shadows for more than 2 decades. What happened that night in Del Rio was not just a tragedy. It was a turning point, the moment when the unimaginable courage of one child stood in stark contrast to the cold-blooded violence of a killer and ensured that justice would finally begin to catch up with him. In the days that followed the brutal murder of Kaylene Harris and the miraculous survival of 10-year-old Krystal Surles, law enforcement in Del Rio, Texas, worked urgently to track down the man responsible. Krystal, despite the devastating wound to her throat, provided police with a remarkably clear description of her attacker: a scruffy, middle-aged drifter with unkempt hair, piercing eyes, and the smell of alcohol. Her account, delivered through whispers and written notes while she recovered in the hospital, was so vivid and precise that investigators had little doubt about the suspect's identity once the first leads began to emerge. Within just a few days, the description led authorities straight to Tommy Lynn Sells, who was found living in the shadows of society as he always had, wandering from place to place, hiding in plain sight, and surviving on odd jobs and theft. When police arrested him, they quickly realized that Krystal's courage had given them exactly what they needed. Forensic evidence, hair samples, fingerprints, and later DNA further connected Sells to the crime scene, removing any doubt that he had been inside the Harris home on the night of the attack. Once in custody, Sells began a series of interrogations that would stun even seasoned investigators. Confronted with the evidence, he not only admitted to killing Kaylene, but also began boasting about dozens of other murders across the United States. With a chilling calmness, he described killings in Missouri, Kentucky, Illinois, West Virginia, and countless other places where young women, children, and entire families have been slaughtered in ways eerily similar to the Harris case. He claimed his killing spree stretched back to the late 1970s, and at times he suggested that he had taken the lives of as many as 70 people during his decades of drifting. For law enforcement, his confessions were both a breakthrough and a nightmare. On one hand, many of the details he revealed matched the specifics of unsolved cases that had haunted small towns and grieving families for years. He knew things only the killer could have known: specific weapons, crime scene positions, and victim details that had never been made public. On the other hand, Sells' reputation for pathological lying cast a long shadow over his claims. He had a history of exaggeration, manipulation, and fabricating stories to shock or confuse. While some of his confessions proved credible and were later confirmed through physical evidence and witness accounts, others remained unverifiable, leaving investigators unsure where the truth ended and Sells' twisted imagination began. Still, there was no denying that with his arrest, one of the most dangerous men in America had finally been taken off the streets. And it was not advanced technology or routine police work that brought him down. It was the extraordinary courage of a young girl who, despite being left for dead, found the strength to describe her attacker and ensure he would never harm anyone again. The arrest of Tommy Lynn Sells in early 2000 set the stage for one of the most gripping trials in Val Verde County, Texas, a community still reeling from the horrific murder of 13-year-old Kaylene Harris and the near-death survival of 10-year-old Krystal Surles. As the case moved into the courtroom, the world watched as a town sought justice and a little girl, scarred both physically and emotionally, prepared to face the man who had tried to silence her forever. During the trial, prosecutors laid out the harrowing details of the New Year's Eve attack, presenting forensic evidence that tied Sells directly to the Harris home, alongside the chilling testimony of medical experts who described the brutality of Kaylene's wounds and the miracle of Krystal's survival. But the most powerful moment came when Krystal Surles herself took the stand. With a scar still visible across her throat, she bravely recounted the events of that night. How she awoke to see her friend Kaylene being stabbed, how Sells turned his blade on her, and how she found the strength to escape and identify her attacker. Her calm, matter-of-fact testimony, delivered by a child who had endured the unimaginable, left the courtroom in stunned silence. The defense attempted to cast doubt on the reliability of Sells' confessions, pointing out his history of lies and exaggerations. They argued that he was a drifter prone to storytelling, someone who thrived on manipulating others. But the weight of physical evidence, combined with Krystal's unshakable testimony, proved overwhelming. In 2000, the jury deliberated and returned a verdict that echoed the outrage and grief of the community. Tommy Lynn Sells was guilty of capital murder. The sentence was clear: he would be put to death by lethal injection. From that moment, Sells joined the long line of condemned inmates on Texas death row, housed in the state's maximum security unit in Livingston. But like many death penalty cases, his path to execution was not immediate. His attorneys launched a series of appeals, not to argue innocence, but to challenge the method of execution itself. Central to their fight was the drug pentobarbital, the powerful sedative used in Texas executions. As pharmaceutical companies increasingly refused to sell drugs for use in lethal injections, the state had turned to compounding pharmacies, whose practices were less transparent and less regulated. Sells' defense argued that secrecy laws surrounding the supplier made it impossible to guarantee the drug's quality or safety, raising the risk of a botched or unconstitutionally painful execution. These appeals wound their way through the courts for years, reaching the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals and even the United States Supreme Court. Judges weighed the arguments, but ultimately, the highest court in the nation denied Sells' appeals, ruling that Texas was not required to disclose the identities of its drug suppliers. With that decision, the last barrier between Tommy Lynn Sells and the execution chamber was removed. For the families of victims, particularly the Harris family, the outcome brought a measure of closure, though it could never replace the life of Kaylene or erase the trauma carried by Krystal. For Sells, it meant that after decades of drifting, lying, and killing, his final destination would be the death chamber in Huntsville, Texas. After his sentencing, Tommy Lynn Sells was transferred to the notorious Texas death row unit in Livingston, a stark concrete fortress where some of the most dangerous men in America awaited their final reckoning. Behind those high fences and layers of razor wire, Sells settled into a routine of isolation, spending 23 hours a day in a single cell, with only brief moments of recreation under strict supervision. Yet even within the confines of death row, he remained the same manipulative, unrepentant figure who had terrorized the highways of America for decades. In interviews conducted during his years of incarceration, Sells often displayed a chilling lack of remorse. He spoke about murder with an unsettling calmness, describing his victims and his crimes not with grief or shame, but with cold detachment, sometimes even with pride. Journalists who met him described a man who seemed to relish the attention, a killer who understood the power of his own infamy and wielded it to disturb anyone willing to listen. His piercing eyes, matter-of-fact tone, and casual recounting of atrocities painted the portrait of a man who was not weighed down by guilt, but instead animated by the shock his words could deliver. While confined, Sells continued to claim responsibility for murders across the nation, recounting stories of killings in states as far apart as California, Illinois, and Kentucky. Investigators and cold case detectives from across the country traveled to Livingston to hear his accounts, and although some of his confessions could never be verified, others were disturbingly accurate, matching long unsolved cases that had left families without answers for years. In a handful of instances, he provided details that only the killer could have known, bringing long overdue closure to grieving families. But just as often, his words proved impossible to substantiate, leaving authorities frustrated and uncertain, forced to sift through his lies to find the fragments of truth. For the families of victims, his life on death row was a cruel paradox. On one hand, they knew he would never again roam free, never again destroy another innocent life. On the other hand, his continued confessions, half-truths, and manipulations meant that closure was often just out of reach. Some families were able to finally lay their loved ones to rest with certainty, but many others were left to wonder if Sells was telling the truth or simply feeding his appetite for control, playing one last game with a world he had tormented for so long. Inside the prison walls, Sells became a study in contradictions, a man both caged and dangerous, powerless yet still able to inflict psychological harm. To some, he was a pathological liar who exaggerated his crimes to inflate his reputation. To others, he was a terrifyingly prolific killer whose full body count may never be known. But what remained undeniable was this. Even on death row, Tommy Lynn Sells refused to give his victims or their families the dignity of peace. On the evening of April 3, 2014, the walls of the Huntsville unit in Texas once again bore witness to the final act of justice as Tommy Lynn Sells, one of America's most notorious serial killers, was escorted from his death row cell and led to the execution chamber. Unlike many condemned inmates who make elaborate or symbolic requests for their last meal, Sells made no special request and instead was served the standard prison fare, a final dinner as unremarkable as the man had been monstrous. As the hours dwindled, victims' families gathered behind the glass partition, bracing themselves for the moment they had waited years to see, while prison officials meticulously followed the protocol that had been rehearsed countless times before. When the time came to offer him the chance for final words, Sells, who had spent decades boasting of murders, manipulating investigators, and shocking interviewers with his chilling indifference, declined to say anything at all, choosing silence in place of one last confession, apology, or act of defiance. At precisely 6 p.m., he was secured to the gurney, and the execution team inserted the intravenous lines that would deliver the lethal dose of pentobarbital, the drug at the center of so many legal battles. As the clear liquid entered his veins, Sells let out several heavy snores, his chest rising and falling in uneven rhythm, before his body grew still and his consciousness slipped away. By 6:27 p.m., he was officially pronounced dead, closing the book on a man who had spent a lifetime preying on the vulnerable and leaving behind a legacy of grief, unanswered questions, and shattered families. For some, the execution was a long overdue measure of justice. For others, it was a reminder that no punishment could ever undo the horrors he inflicted. In that quiet chamber in Huntsville, the journey of Tommy Lynn Sells ended. Not with the sensationalism he often courted, but with silence, stillness, and the finality of death. As the screen fades to a montage of photographs, the bright smile of 13-year-old Kaylene Harris, the courageous face of Krystal Surles, who lived to tell the truth, and the countless unnamed victims whose stories will forever remain in shadows. The narrative comes full circle, reminding us that the tale of Tommy Lynn Sells is not simply that of a killer brought to justice, but of the unmeasurable human cost of unchecked violence, missed warning signs, and systemic failures that allowed him to drift across the country for decades, leaving destruction in his path. His execution may have marked the end of his life, but for the families who still search for answers, for the investigators who continue to piece together fragments of forgotten cases, and for the survivors who carry scars both seen and unseen, true closure remains elusive, because with Sells came not only confirmed atrocities, but also chilling confessions that blurred the line between fact and fiction, leaving us to wonder how many stories of loss will forever remain unanswered. And while justice found its place in the sterile chamber of Huntsville on that April evening, the devastation he caused serves as a permanent reminder of the fragility of safety, the resilience of survivors, and the haunting reality that some crimes can never truly be buried in history. As the images linger on screen and the music swells with somber finality, the call extends directly to you. If you found this documentary insightful, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth true crime stories that uncover both the darkness of human nature and the resilience of those left behind, and comment below with your thoughts. Do you believe Tommy Lynn Sells was ever fully truthful about the true number of his victims, or will that mystery forever remain hidden in the shadows of his lies?